Ferruccio Lamborghini is the man behind one of the biggest luxury car brands in the world. But what most people don't know about him is that before he started making supercars, he actually had the biggest tractor company in Italy. And what even less people know is that before he was a tractor tycoon, he was a prisoner of war. Ferruccio's engineering skills are what helped him create some of the best tractors in the world. But an argument with Enzo Ferrari is what would make him change course and set out to create the best supercar in the world, leading to a huge ongoing battle between the two men. But before we get to all that, let's first go back to a small town in Italy in 1916. Ferruccio Lamborghini was the child of two grape farmers. Growing up in Italy at that time was tough. It was a country struck by financial ruin after the war, and shortages of food, many of its citizens were going hungry. But despite the hardships, Ferruccio managed to have an optimistic outlook on life. He spent his childhood working on his parents' grape farm. Ferruccio's father had hoped that one day his son would be the heir to this farm, which had been passed down from generation to generation. But the young Lamborghini had other plans. Growing up on the farm, Ferruccio had learnt the value of hard work, but he'd also discovered his passion for mechanics. The Lamborghinis had a tractor that Ferruccio would spend hours taking apart and fixing every day. At that time, automobiles were still in their infancy. Mechanics was cutting-edge technology, and Ferruccio was much more interested in engines than traditional old farming. This meant that when Ferruccio left school, he had a big decision to make. Does he become a farmer like his father, continuing the family tradition, or does he completely change course, following his passions, and become an engineer? And of course, much to his father's disappointment, he chose engineering and moved to Bologna to attend a technical college. After graduating, Ferruccio got a job as a mechanic, but it wouldn't be long before the world was plunged into another war. Ferruccio was drafted into the Royal Italian Air Force, but when his mechanical abilities were discovered, he was sent to the Greek island of Rhodes to help with maintaining the army's tractors and diesel trucks. Ferruccio didn't know it at the time, but this experience of working with military vehicles and tractors would come in very handy later down the line. In 1943, Italy signed an armistice agreement, effectively announcing their part in the war was over. The Italian troops were evicted from Rhodes, and Germany took over the garrison. But Ferruccio asked to stay as a citizen and opened his own mechanical workshop on the island. But then as the war was ending in 1945, Germany was facing defeat, and the Allied forces took over Rhodes Island. They initially took everyone as prisoners, including Ferruccio. Luckily for him, after seeing Ferruccio's mechanical skills, the Allied forces simply had him spend a year fixing their vehicles, before in 1946 allowing him to leave and return home to Italy. And it's here that the incredible story of Lamborghini really begins. After Ferruccio returned to Italy, he faced a problem. He no longer had a job. He'd spent his time on Rhodes working as a mechanic, but now he felt like he wanted to do something more. And while he was back in Italy, he saw a market starting to emerge. He noticed that poor farmers couldn't afford to buy tractors after the war. Not only that, but the price of petrol skyrocketed due to the post-war prohibitions, so many farmers couldn't even afford to run their tractors. Ferruccio saw all of this happening around him and decided he could solve some of these problems. The Italian government was auctioning off military vehicles to try and fund their economic rebuild, and Ferruccio seized this opportunity. He'd spent many years working on a lot of the vehicles, and so he knew exactly what he needed and what price he should pay. He managed to buy a cheap British Morris engine at auction, which he was able to modify. Ferruccio's new engine design used a fuel atomizer. This meant that whilst they still needed petrol to get started, once they were started, the engine switched to the much cheaper diesel fuel. This was an incredible innovation and a genius workaround for his country's fuel problem, and thus the very first Lamborghini tractor was born. And he also used a smaller frame to reduce the cost even further. Not so fast though. Sure, Lamborghini had innovated the engine and built a very well-made tractor, but the market was already dominated by very well-established tractor brands, the likes of Fiat, Trattori, and Landini. There wasn't much room for a newcomer. And so, despite the great design, Lamborghini tractors started very slowly. At first, Ferruccio was simply making one tractor a week, completely by himself. But his tractors were selling. His cost-cutting techniques proved to be a very effective sales pitch. In fact, it wouldn't be long before Ferruccio opened up his own factory and hired some staff to help speed up the production of his tractors. But in order to really ramp up production and compete with the bigger tractor companies, he needed money. And so his father allowed him to use the family farm as collateral for a bank loan, and Ferruccio was able to buy 1,000 Morris engines and get to work. Ferruccio was extremely excited about the potential of his business, but because of this business loan he'd taken out, he knew that if his company failed, his family could lose their farm. The good news though was that Ferruccio's technical ingenuity had allowed him to successfully break into the tractor market, and he already had another trick up his sleeve, as Ferruccio managed to design his own engine, meaning Lamborghini tractors would no longer be relying on modifying the British engine, and instead could create their own engines in-house. And this ended up being really perfect timing. The Italian government announced they would grant loans to Italian farmers that were purchasing Italian-made farming machinery, and since Ferruccio was now making the engines himself, his machinery qualified, and he saw a huge rise in demand for his tractors. By this point, Lamborghini was producing 200 tractors a year, and Ferruccio was so convinced by the quality of his tractors that every year he would host a tractor pulling competition in his hometown. 2 tractors would be tied together and compete in a kind of tug-of-war style competition to determine which tractors performed the best. Lamborghini tractors always won. So at this point, things were looking good for Ferruccio. As he ramped up production even more, Lamborghini tractors started to become one of the biggest tractor manufacturers in all of Italy, and as a result, Ferruccio was now becoming one of the richest men in the country. However, whilst all of this was going on, Ferruccio somehow managed to find time to modify a Fiat Topolino that he owned. He added a bigger engine, removed the back seats, and entered into one of Italy's most famous races. Ferruccio was excited to test his car against some of the biggest names like Alfa Romeo, Ferrari, and Maserati. However, disaster would strike midway through the race, as Ferruccio crashed his car into the side of a restaurant in Turin. This would mark the end of Ferruccio's racing career and completely change the direction of his life.